They were one of the biggest rock bands of the 90s, selling millions of albums with ready rock bangers that were heavily influenced by none other than the Replacements. Before the Goos were the Goos, though, they were actually called the Sex Maggots, which was a far cry from the Goos of the 90s, which, let's be honest, you couldn't escape the Goos in the mid to late 90s, even if you tried, as they dominated the radio, MTV, and movie soundtracks with a sound that was both massive, emotional, and incredibly polished. This is the story of how a gang of hardcore punk rock wannabes from Buffalo, New York, went on the road with their heroes and came back with a secret formula for superstardom. Before the multi-platinum albums and stadium tours, the Goo Goo Dolls were just another band of scruffy kids from a Rust Belt town who wanted to be the Replacements so badly. Formed in Buffalo, New York in the mid-'80s by Johnny Resnick and Robbie Takak.
Takak?
I think that's how you say that. Their early sound was a world away from the ballads that would make them famous. Their first records, like their self-titled debut in 1987 and Jed in 1989, were messy, fast, and fueled by cheap beer and hardcore punk influences. A far cry from songs like Iris and Slide that basically owned late 90s radio and have been stuck in our heads ever since. They were a garage band in the truest sense of the word, full of bratty attitude and a sound that owed everything to the exploded college rock and hardcore scenes of its time. Back then, critics and even some fans wrote them off as imitators, or a watered-down version of more quote-unquote authentic bands. In an interview, Johnny Resnick admitted their first album was all balls and no brains, made by kids who couldn't believe anyone would actually give them a record deal. They were playing a part, trying on the sounds of bands they worshipped. And at the very top of that list of heroes was a group of misfit geniuses from Minneapolis. Stocky bassist Robbie Takak had talked about how the music of Minnesota, bands like Husker Du and Soul Asylum, was a massive influence. But one band stood above them all. The Goo Goo Dolls didn't just admire the Replacements, they were students of their sound, their attitude, and their hard-on-the-sleeve approach to rock and roll. They were fans, desperately trying to emulate their idols, without yet understanding what made them so special. They had the noise, but they hadn't quite found the heart. To really get the Goo Goo Dolls transformation, you first have to understand the Replacements. Led by the brilliant, tormented songwriter Paul Westerberg. Paul was a classic songwriter raised on the Beatles, Big Star, and the Rolling Stones. Outside of fellow Minneapolis trio Husker Du, another trio with two lead singers, and Soul Asylum, the Replacements were maybe the most critically acclaimed band of the 1980s to never have a real hit. They were a total paradox. A band that could write a song as heartbreakingly beautiful as Unsatisfied, and then drunkenly butcher it on stage that same night. They were the patron saints of triumphant failure due to their stubbornness and refusal to play the industry game. Westerberg was a once-in-a-generation talent, writing lyrics that were profoundly poetic, painfully honest, and hilariously juvenile all at once. He perfected a kind of rock song that was both tough and tender, mixing drunken punk fury with heartbroken and earnestly sincere melodies and lyrics. The band was firmly in the hardcore lane, even pushing aforementioned Husker Du to play faster.
Fuck yeah. Faster, faster, faster.
They were also doing a lot of meth.
Well, that would explain the faster.
Albums such as Let It Be and Tim cemented the Replacements as underground rock legends, but their genius was matched only by their incredible knack for self-destruction. The stories are legendary. They were famously banned for life from Saturday Night Live in 1986 after a drunken, chaotic performance where they swapped clothes and stumbled through their songs. They showed up to important industry showcases completely wasted, intentionally torpedoing their only chances at mainstream success. They were just too real, too volatile, too beautifully human to play the corporate rock game. While other bands were chasing MTV and stadium tours, the Replacements were chasing the next beer and the next perfect, broken-hearted song. They were adored by critics and a cult following of fans who saw their own messy lives reflected back at them in the music of the Replacements. They were without a doubt the best losers in rock and roll. And for a young band from Buffalo, they weren't just heroes. They were a cautionary tale and a massive source of inspiration. In 1991, the Goo Goo Dolls landed the gig of a lifetime, opening for the Replacements on what would become their legendary farewell tour. For a band of devoted fans, this was so much more than a support slot. It was a pilgrimage. It was a rolling masterclass, a chance to watch their idols from the side of stage night after night. Can you imagine being Johnny Resnick at the time? A young songwriter who admits that Paul Westerberg was his obvious influence, given that his melodies, vocal timbre, and cadence were all Westerberg-isms. Every night he wasn't just seeing the drunken antics the Replacements were famous for, he was witnessing up close how Paul Westerberg could hold an audience in the palm of his hand with nothing but a beat-up guitar and a raw, trembling voice. The Goos, at this point, were moving away from pure punk and towards something that sounded an awful like power pop. They were consciously or not starting to sound a lot like certain bands from Minneapolis. The tour where they opened for the Replacements was also the classroom where the Goo Goo Dolls learned their most important lesson, the power of their heroes' music music wasn't in the speed or the volume. It was in its vulnerability. It was in the willingness to lay your insecurities, heartbreaks, and hopeless dreams bare, and then wrap them up in a killer pop hook. They were learning the secret recipe directly from the master chefs. They saw the brilliance of the Replacement's songwriting, but they also saw the chaos that was tearing the band apart. They got a front row seat to both the genius and the self-sabotage that define their heroes. The tour was the catalyst. It's where the Goo Goo Dolls stopped being imitators and started becoming inheritors, or rather, what I like to call big box the Replacements. This was also the time period in which lead vocal duties switched from stocky Buffalo hometown hero Robbie Takak to Hollywood sellout fakey plastic bimbo boy Johnny Resnick as the face and recognizable platinum selling sound of the Goos. The change wasn't immediate, but the seeds planted on that 1991 tour started to grow. In 1993, the Goo Goo Dolls released the album Superstar Car Wash, and the shift was undeniable. And right there in the liner notes was the ultimate proof of their mentorship. The lyrics for the song We Are the Normal were co-written by Paul Westerberg himself.
I don't know about this era.
I pick up on the Goos on A Boy Named Goo.
They have an album named A Boy Named Goo?
And it's like a baby covered in like jam.
So do they refer to themselves as the Goos? Or
No.
You came up.
Shmoo is coming up
That's
with
your
Goo,
affectionate
with the
name
Goos.
for them.
Resnick had written the music and in an act of pure fanboy courage had mailed the tape to his idol, who would then write the words. First, the outright admissions. Johnny Resnick had been very open about his admiration for Paul Westerberg, calling him an obvious influence and an enormous influence on his songwriting. In one interview, Resnick named the Replacements album to him as the core record for the band's identity. Bassist Robbie Takak had owned the connection. While saying they never set out to outright imitate them, he did admit, though, in a 1995 interview, that a lot of the reason we sound the way we do is that we listened to a lot of things they did as we were coming up. When asked in 1993 if he got tired of the comparisons, Takak said, "Yeah, but you know, whatever. I love that band." He knew the Replacements were the most obvious point of reference. Resnick later said of the experience, "To some people, Keith Richards is their hero. I feel that way about Westerberg. I got to do it with Westerberg." That was amazing to me. The song itself, a soaring, string-laden anthem about feeling like an outsider, was a clear bridge from their punk past to their more melodic future. All right. Now let's talk about my favorite Goo Goo Dolls album. Then came 1995's A Boy Named Goo and the song that changed everything, Name.
The baby.
Yeah, the
Nirvana Goo.
aforementioned baby with the jam on his
Got it.
face. All the lessons from the Westerberg School of Songwriting just clicked. Name was built on an acoustic guitar, a melancholic and unusual tuning, and lyrics that spoke of feeling lost and disconnected, all hallmarks of a Replacements classic. But this was a polished focus and produced for a massive audience. It was the quote-unquote hard-on-the-sleeve ethos of the Replacements, but translated into a language that Top 40 radio could understand. The song was a huge hit, and it fundamentally changed the band's entire trajectory, even if it ticked off some of the band's early punk fans. This all set the stage for Iris. By the time Resnick wrote that iconic song for the City of Angels soundtrack, he completely mastered the formula.
Could you imagine Meg Ryan and Nicolas Cage as the main love interest of a movie now?
Are they blindly riding a bike together?
And more or less referring to the fact that Meg Ryan and Nicolas Cage, they look like people, right? And now you would not see love interest in the movie that look like people, like regular people.
But to be fair, plastic bimbo Johnny Resnick doesn't look like a person anymore.
No.
He looks like a man doll. Iris took the intimate, personal pain that Westerberg specialized in and scaled it up to an epic, big box, cinematic level. It was vulnerable, but it was also vast. It was the sound of a band that had finally figured out how to take the messy, beautiful, broken heart of their heroes and make it beat for the entire world. They had taken the Losers' blueprint and built a palace with it. The Replacements were rock and roll's great what if. They had the songs, the critical acclaim, and the heart to be one of the biggest bands in the world, but they were just too beautifully flawed, too true to their own chaotic spirit to seal the deal. They drew the map to a kind of new rock music, one that was melodic, emotional, and brutally honest, but they basically crashed the car before they could reach their destination. So after all this evidence, the similar riffs and vocals, the shared lyrical themes, the identical career arc, and the smoking gun of collaboration, we're back to the big question. Did the Goo Goo Dolls copy the Replacements? The answer, like the music itself, is a more complicated tapestry than a simple yes. Calling it copying feels cheap. It implies a kind of theft. What happened here was different. The Goo Goo Dolls didn't just copy the Replacements, they absorbed them. They worshipped them. They internalized the musical and emotional language that Paul Westerberg and his band created. And they were, without a doubt, devoted students. A better word might be that they inherited the sound. The Replacements created a brilliant, heartfelt, and commercially volatile formula for alternative rock. The Goo Goo Dolls took that same formula, sanded down the roughest, most self-destructive edges, and gave it a slightly more radio-friendly polish. Their career arc mirrors the Replacements arc, but where the Replacements zigged, into commercial oblivion. The Goo Goo Dolls zagged right into superstardom. They took the beautiful mess and cleaned it up just enough for the mainstream to fall in love with it. They were the ones to finally cash the check that the replacements had written. This story isn't one of plagiarism, but of popularization. The Goo Goo Dolls' incredible success doesn't take away from their own talent for writing hooks, but it does serve as the ultimate proof of the sound their idols pioneered. In a way, every platinum record that the Goo Goo Dolls sold was a testament to the power of the blueprint the replacements laid out a decade earlier. They proved that Paul Westerberg's heart-on-the-sleeve rock and roll could, in fact, conquer the world. It just needed a different messenger. Ultimately, this is a story about how influence works in music. It's about standing on the shoulders of giants. The Goo Goo Dolls are a massively successful band in their own right, but their story is forever tied to the legacy of those perpetually underrated underdog heroes from Minneapolis. They didn't just steal the flame. They took the torch that was offered and carried it to the heights its creators could only dream of. The Goo Goo Dolls, who were the replacements' dedicated apprentices, simply picked that map up from off the floor, and they learned from their heroes' brilliance, but they also learned from their mistakes, more importantly. They took that raw, vulnerable songwriting, sanded down the roughest edges, and polished those melodies until they absolutely shone. The massive success of songs like Name and Iris isn't a betrayal of their punk roots or of the replacements' legacy in many ways. It's the ultimate fulfillment of it. The Goo Goo Dolls proved that the heart-on-your-sleeve rock that Paul Westerberg pioneered could connect with millions. They became the superstars their mentors were always supposed to be, showing the world that sometimes it takes rock's best losers to create its biggest and stockiest winner in Robbie and plastic surgery nightmare Johnny Resnick.
I like that. There you go.
The story of the student surpassing the master, album sales-wise, is a classic tale in music. The DNA of our favorite bands is often full of surprising ancestors. So who are some other artists you can think of whose sound was totally shaped by an unlikely hero? Let us know your favorite examples of musical mentorship in the comments. And if you love uncovering the secret histories behind the music, make sure you subscribe to Hidden Histories presented by the High Epic Times for more. See you in the next video.